Only breaking news tonight regarding a man from California who made threats against the president and vice president of the United States.
He was pulled over more than 2 years ago after driving through Omaha on his way to Washington, D.C. Brian Mastry is live in the studio with the details.
Aaron, today this California grocery store clerk pleaded guilty to threats against the president. In return, the government will drop the charge of attempting to kill the president. Kwachua Brilliant Chong will also surrender his rifle and ammunition. Now, this case goes back to December of 2021 when Chong was pulled over on I-80 in western Iowa by a Cass County Sheriff's deputy. He was weaving in and out of traffic. Investigators say he had the White House address on his GPS, cash set aside in his vehicle, earmarked for his own funeral expenses. When asked if he had a hotel in D.C., Chong allegedly told them that getting a hotel would not be necessary. In court documents, the defendant also is alleged to have told deputies that upon his arrival in D.C., he intended to kill President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Investigators said his hit list was based on downloaded videos of these individuals on TikTok. He had more than 100 videos featuring Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Mark Zuckerberg. He also told investigators that nothing but this traffic stop would stop him. Besides the rifle and ammo, there was body armor in his car and a grappling hook he said he intended to use to get over the perimeter fence to get access to the White House. Okay, what happens now? There'll be a pre-sentence investigation, which takes weeks, if not longer, and a recommendation from the government about how much federal prison time he should serve. By the way, maximum sentence in this case, 5 years in prison. On your side in the studio, Brian Mastry, 6 News.
All right.